Hey guys, welcome back. So now getting into Powers of 10, which I feel like makes a little more sense revisiting it after our whole breakdown of the 10 lives of Moira McTaggart, with the exception of the 6th one because we don't know what she was doing, at least not yet, not at this point. But coming from there and going back into Powers of 10, which continues with her 10th life, but it also gives us glimpses into her possible 11th, which Destiny had mentioned Moira would get if she played her cards right. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so you can squad up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so getting into Powers of 10, I want to build off some of the groundwork of what we had talked about in the previous House of X video, where I did the breakdown of where all this began, with the multiple life and times of Moira McTaggart, which ultimately led to her 10th life, to where she's like, okay, I tried doing it myself, I tried going to Charles Xavier, I tried going to Magneto, I tried going to Apocalypse, and none of those worked. And as far as number of lifetimes go, we know because of what Destiny told her, Moira pretty much has 10 and possibly 11 lives that she can live depending on the course of her actions, which is what brought us to lifetime number 10, where she said, okay, I'm using everything. I'm pulling out all the stops and I'm going to everybody, because throughout all these lifetimes, that's the one thing that she hasn't tried. And it's that journey that takes us to year 1 of Moira's lifetime, and from there we begin to see what happens from year 1 going into year 10, into year 100, and then into year 1000, with Moira telling Charles and others everything she's experienced throughout her different lives, because she's more or less learned at this point that regardless of how powerful some of these mutants are individually, that they really don't stand a chance unless they all can make this work out together. And so moving forward, this pretty much turns the X-Men and every mutant into the Golden State Warriors, and doing so with this 10th lifetime possibly being her last chance at making this work. And so now starting with year 1, to where on the surface it seems that Moira McTaggart is meeting Charles Xavier for the first time. But rather than doing this like the times that we talked about before in her previous lives, where she either ignored him and tried to make a quote cure for mutants, or she allied with him, doing everything that she could for mutants to live peacefully, or her attempting to help Magneto or even Apocalypse, but ultimately what this is showing us is that not just Charles, but none of these leaders have been right up to this point. But at least this time around, with giving Charles all of this information, and then from there making the attempt to get all the other leaders on board, and very much needing the help from Charles to do so that he can help Moira show others everything that she has seen over multiple lifetimes. But after showing Charles, this then takes them to meet Magneto, which makes sense with him being one of the first mutants that Charles has known personally, and even prior to them discovering each other's powers, Eric was one of the few people that Charles had many conversations with about how the future could play out in a way that was safe for mutants. But their existing history kind of built the basis for Charles to come out here to Island M with Moira, which at the time nobody else would even dare to visit. But I do love the conversation that they have getting into this, because it's very reminiscent of when they first met in what I would guess would be maybe 15 to 20 years prior to this point in Israel, when Charles Xavier traveled there to help Holocaust victims, which is also when he met Gabrielle Haller, who would later become the mother of Legion. But as far as how Hickman is handling this with the timeline, it's kind of tough to tell, with Moira first meeting Charles and he's walking, and then when they go to see Magneto, he's in a wheelchair, which could in that case make it be an even longer amount of time. But one of the things that we pick up pretty quickly is that Charles and Eric at the time, who just went by Magnus, when they first met each other, for both of them it was the first time that they could actually sit down and talk to someone and really have a reasonable debate about either humans and mutants coexisting, or should mutants just take over before humans make the decision to get rid of them altogether as an act out of fear. And sure, most of this came from Magneto having a much rougher upbringing than Charles, but at the end of the day, these were two people who wanted the exact same thing, which ultimately was the survival of the mutant race. And after revealing their powers to one another after facing Hydra and Baron von Strucker, neither of their ideals were swayed, and this is ultimately what caused them to drift apart. But when Charles comes here with Moira to meet Magneto and share with him everything that Moira has showed Charles, initially Eric is reluctant to do so, because at first when Charles tells him that neither of their ways are right, to Eric it just sounds like Charles is giving up. And in addition to that, he's a bit hesitant, because for all he knows, Charles could just be making all this up and just planting some kind of fictional tale in his mind. But off of the sheer friendship and history, Eric removes his helmet so Charles could let Moira in, and all of the lifetimes that he sees, it's just too much for anybody to make up, and he literally just watches his dream go wrong in multiple different scenarios. But after seeing everything that Moira had to show him, not only was he in, but he'll do whatever's needed of him to see this through. But before even hearing the details of how they're gonna do this, Eric lets him know that he's gonna give it everything he got, and if he notices Charles doing any less, he gonna straight up check him and let him know. And he says this more so to the extent that if there's any moment that Charles grows feels weak, that Eric will be right there to see this through. And so now from here, jumping forward into year 10, and still within Moira's 10th lifetime, but as we can see within this timeline, a lot of things throughout this past 10 years have played out differently than the way we've known them to play out, and throughout the history of X-Men, X-Factor, likely even X-Force, Excalibur, like everything's different. And one of those main differences are your flowers of Krakoa, which we see Colossus picking from Krakoa so the X-Men can plant them in Westchester, the blue area of the moon, on Mars, the Savage Land, Washington DC, and through the course of time, these plants of Krakoa will serve 6 different purposes. Well, really 2 different purposes, 3 for humans to be used as advanced drugs, and the other 3 pertain to mutant transport and habitation. And so now the 3 that are for humans, labeled L, I, and M, with the L that extends human life, the I is like your super antibiotic, and the M cures diseases of the mind. And on the instructions it says that they're just for humans, but I have my speculations of mutants taking them too. But as for the other 3 flowers, which are exclusive to mutants, for these you have your gateway, to where once planted they can provide a transit from wherever you're at to Krakoa. The second, which is your habitat, is able to produce a self-sustaining environment much like Krakoa, but it's plants like this one which make it possible to be planted on Mars and essentially create a habitat in a place that would otherwise seem unlivable. And all the while that it's there, though separate from Krakoa, it's still connected to Krakoa's consciousness. And so now the 6th one, which is very similar to the 5th, which creates the habitats, but the 6th one, which occurs unnaturally, it creates habitats within Krakoa's ecosystem that are not a part of Krakoa's consciousness, and they appear very much like tumors within the ecosystem. And the 6th one, which is referred to as your no place flower, we'll get a bit deeper into that later on, because I believe the concept in itself of the no place flower, it leans deeper into your lost years within this timeline, and Mr. Sinister and him having his own agenda, and I don't want to lean too heavy into all of that just yet. But mainly just keep in mind the first 3 flowers were converted to like pills to help humans and provide advanced pharmaceuticals for the human race, and the second 3, which apply to the mutants on Krakoa, the first 2 make a way for safe transit and habitation, while the third within this group is very obscure at the moment because it's something that will definitely come back when we go deeper into what happens 100 years from now, and after that 1,000 years from now. But for now, just keep it in the back of your mind, because for now we're really just setting the tone for the groundwork for the 4 periods in time along this timeline. But so now, still within year 10, you have your relationship between the humans and the mutants, to where the humans see that the mutants, they pretty much built their own nation here in Krakoa, which they didn't ask permission for, but rather is something that they just did. And prior to the point of Charles Xavier making his proposal to the humans of what they could offer, he had been leading mutants out from different locations, like the Xavier Academy in Westchester, and other locations like the Jerusalem habitat, which Xavier used to provide safety and transport before making his offer to the humans, and even making them aware of Krakoa, which was really smart because this gave the mutants a head start to not only ensure the safety of mutants in other locations, but also force the hand of the humans in their decision once Charles Xavier made his proposal to them, which in turn offered humans a benefit, but in the form of a deal that they had to take, because at the moment that the humans became aware, Charles and the others were well off into their plans, which would take decades to come to fruition. And so now when members of the American government made their way to this Jerusalem spot, and only able to do so via mutant escort, when they arrived to mull over the details that Charles had telepathically proposed, when they arrived there, they're met by Magneto. And it's almost like Xavier was like, Magneto, I'm gonna let you handle this one, because this way they most likely won't read the terms and conditions and they'll just click agree. But even though on one hand the humans are shaking hands with the mutants, and mainly for 2 reasons, with the first being that they're years ahead in planning and months ahead as far as a lot of their execution, but for the humans in their other hand, which is behind their back, for a number of years they've been making plans themselves. And this came by the way of an organization that they had formed by the name of Orcus, and they began 2 years prior only in the form of observation, but they had did this by pulling humans from every strategic organization you can think of. And it was formed initially because of the spike in mutant population, but in forming this organization they pulled people from every strategic group in the world. And I mean, they got people from AIM, SHIELD, Strike, Sword, Alpha Flight, Hammer, Armor, and Hydra. But with patrolling the main 3 factors of the human threat, that's where the observation began, with them observing mutant population, mutant related financial purchases, and also substantial territorial shifts that were made by mutants. But in the past 2 years, they were only in a mode of observation. But in the latter half of those 2 years, they got red flags on all 3 of the categories which they considered mutants to be the most dangerous, because with population, the mutant population was spiking. And while observing financial, Xavier purchases the 7th largest pharmaceutical company in the world, which he would later use to distribute the first 3 human drugs that we had talked about earlier. And last but not least, in the category of territory, you got the establishment of Krakoa, which essentially gave them red flags on all 3 fronts. And so now within Orchis, you have Dr. Alia Gregor, who's head of science command under Dr. Killian Devo, and she had began humanitarian research into mutant repopulation following the events of the Genosian genocide, which is something we had seen back in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, where we got the crazy story of Charles Xavier's twin sister, Cassandra Nova Xavier, who, as it turned out, she was the manifestation of what the Shi'ar were called Mumandri, I believe how you say it, but according to the Shi'ar's mythology, this particular being or entity, it's something that one would have to fight in the womb before birth, with this entity being the opposite of whoever needed to be born. And this essentially is what Cassandra was to Charles Xavier, with him having to kill her in the womb before being born in order to make it out alive. I know it's crazy, but as it turned out, the battle between these two induced the labor of Charles' mother, to where at birth Charles survived and Cassandra was announced dead at delivery. But over the course of some years later, with Cassandra being this opposite of Charles Xavier, but also being this alien entity, during the course of Grant Morrison's X-Men, she spent that time reforming her body cell by cell and planning her revenge towards Charles Xavier. And so after she returned, she recruited the nephew of Bolivar Trask, and she takes him to a secret wild master mode that I believe was like in South America or something like that. But she had taken Donald Trask here, the nephew of Bolivar Trask, only to use him because he had voice authorization. And after painfully stealing like 3 billion letters of his DNA and copied them to herself, to where she used the authorization to this wild master mode to commit genocide in Genosha. And so now, an important thing to keep in mind is that with your traditional master mode, Bolivar Trask designed it in order to just produce multiple sentinels, but this is also something that Cassandra considered inadequate, and this is one of the reasons she considered your wild master mode to be a bit more effective, because it would produce sentinels out of anything, which is one of the main reasons at the time that this attack in Genosha was so successful. And when this happened, this produced the slaughter of 16 million mutants. And prior to this point, Dr. Alia Gregor, who is now a member of Orchis, she had originally believed that the mutant population, it would never overtake the human population, and mainly because of scientific advancements, breakthroughs in genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence. But after the genocide of Genosha, she realizes that had it not been for the genocide that had taken place, that not only would the mutant race outnumber the human race, but prior to the attack on Genosha, this would have taken place in only 10 years. And with the number of mutants who were slain in Genosha, all this did was push it back to 20 years. And so now at this point, we find that Orchis, who appears to use pieces of the old master mode and fine-tune them to create the station that is like your mother to your brother and sister machines. And they've reached this level of progress throughout the course of like 6 months, likely due to the fact that the wild master mode is able to produce other sentinels in order to carry out this work at a quicker rate. And this station, though not perfect, like they ran into some snags over the course of 6 months, and mainly because of Orchis rushing in order to get it operational, with them recently discovering that time is not on their side, but also with the recent discovery of Charles Xavier purchasing the 7th largest pharmaceutical company, and months after that, the discovery of Krakoa, they switched the production of the sentinels that they had built into mining more materials so they can build more sentinels. And so now from here, we jump over to Mystique, Sabretooth, and Toad, who have broken into damage control to receive some confidential information. And prior to this point, as far as public knowledge, damage control has really just been collecting hazardous weapons and different technologies which may pose as a threat to the government. But what we come to find out is that as a result of Reed Richards missing after Secret Wars, and during the time that Tony Stark was presumed dead during Civil War II, damage control had also been collecting their technology, all the while making plans for a little bit more, which is why Mystique, Sabretooth, and Toad are here to steal this information off their local drives and take it back to Krakoa. But after they receive the files that they need and they make their way out, they're met by the arrival of the Fantastic Four. And when they arrive, Sabretooth, he tells Mystique and Toad that he'll hold them off so that they can get back to Krakoa with the information. But as it turned out, this didn't work out too well for him. And it's like, come on, think about it. Like, Sabretooth versus the Fantastic Four is really no contest. And we see this not only with the Thing who clobbers the mess out of him, but also when Mystique and Toad make it through the gateway. But when Sabretooth leaps full speed into a wall created by Sue Storm in front of the gateway, she then just traps him in a box and he's done. Like, he really didn't have much of a chance, especially when Sue and Reed showed up. But what I like that Hickman does, like as soon as this happens, Cyclops arrives and he's like, okay, these are mutants who caused this, and along the terms of amnesty for citizens of Krakoa, he insists that Reed Richards just lets him go and Krakoa will take it from here. And all the while that he's doing this, Cyclops is just acting like he didn't know why Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth were here, but all the while Cyclops, Sabretooth, Mystique, Toad, Magneto, Charles, they all been working together. And with Cyclops showing up here and just acting like Krakoan police, waving around amnesty and saying we'll take it from here, he really doesn't try that hard to get Sabretooth out of this snag, which surprises Sabretooth because he knows that this mission was a mission that the X-Men were in on together, but Cyclops doesn't necessarily try too hard, one, because it could likely blow the cover of this whole operation, but also I think because it's Sabretooth and he's kind of like, who cares? So as a result, Cyclops just leaves Sabretooth there, but upon leaving he drops the idea in the mind of Sue and the others that Krakoa is a place of safety for those born with special gifts, and if their son Franklin Richards ever needs a place to stay, that they're saving room especially for him. And him doing this just kind of drops the idea in their mind for Sue and the others to kind of mow over. And so now upon the arrival of Mystique and Toad, who more or less had to leave Sabretooth behind, they arrive back in Krakoa with a flash drive filled with the information that they had stolen from Damage Control. And like I mentioned before, this whole data heist was a group effort. Mystique, Magneto, Charles, Cyclops, everybody was in on it, even poor Sabretooth who got left behind. And when Mystique and Toad arrive here, Mystique begins to express her request to wanting something more for the risk that they've been taking, but Charles tells her that creating a better world for mutants, that this alone should be reward enough. But before I go any further, we gotta talk about this helmet that Charles Xavier is wearing, because I'm pretty sure that this is Cerebra, which is like your successor to Cerebro when Cerebro was destroyed. And I say this because we have also seen this version of Cerebra in Grant Morrison's new X-Men, because also at the time, Cassandra Xavier, the twin sister of Charles Xavier, and I'm not gonna go too deep into the argument of this being actually his sister, or just the alien Mumundri, whatever entity that she was supposed to be. I'm gonna leave that alone. That whole thing just kind of threw me for a loop, but I'm pretty sure that this is Cerebra, and it's likely that Hickman has brought this back as an additional reference to Grant Morrison's new X-Men to kind of show us that the events that had taken place there, that they still take place within this timeline in some way, form, or fashion. But here's the part that gets me, because at the time when she made her way to Cerebra, to where the X-Men thought she was taking it in order to finish off the other mutants after the genocide of Genosha, but instead when this happened, she actually used it to switch bodies with Charles Xavier, which is kind of messed up because Emma Frost pretty much snapped her neck, or more or less snapped his neck, with that really being Charles Xavier after Cassandra used Cerebra in order to make the switch. And so now this is one of those things throughout the course of Powers of 10 that just has me thinking, like, how much of new X-Men is Hickman actually keeping? Because as it turned out at the time, with Emma Frost snapping Charles's neck while he was in the body of Cassandra, that didn't necessarily kill him. And Cassandra, who was in Charles's body, she shot Charles so he couldn't tell them the truth, and also so that she could hold up the illusion of stealing the body of Charles and continue to fool the X-Men. But I will say this, hopefully, just hopefully, with the return of Cerebra, that Hickman is still holding true to the conclusion where the X-Men figured this out by way of Jean Grey, who later returned Charles Xavier back into his body, and with the help of Emma Frost, they trapped Cassandra back into her own body, her old dead body. But now back to Powers of 10, and hopefully you guys kind of feel me on this, but I feel like Jonathan Hickman has taken my brain and just tied it in a knot, because the madness is making sense, but at the same time there's so many possibilities in between everything that's going on. But either way, back to Powers of 10. But so now at this point, where the X-Men have more or less made their way through these files, and they discover the confidential plans which were being held at Damage Control, they discover that on those drives that they had the schematics for a mother mode, which is pretty much a master mode that makes master modes. And when they see this, like just pretty much off of the idea of what happened in Genosha, seeing this is like their nightmare's biggest nightmare. And so now from the information that they have, they're aware that construction is completed. But at this point in time, it's still in a dormant phase because it appears that they're waiting for the right mutant target in order to launch this attack. But also on this drive, they're filled in on the rest of the details on Orchis, like the organizations which they recruited from prior to this point, and much of the details of Orchis which we talked about earlier. But in addition to seeing the schematics for Mother Mode and being made aware of the number of organizations involved in Orchis, they also discovered that Orchis already has the plans to make Nimrod operational. And although in this timeline Nimrod hasn't come to fruition just yet, they're already well aware of who Nimrod is, mainly because of the revelation of the life and times of Moira McTaggart. And with them discovering this and seeing Nimrod already on the way and the Mother Mold already built, this is pretty much like the humans jumping from your brick-sized cell phone but having the plans for your iPhone 11 tucked away somewhere in the corner, because Nimrod is just that much more advanced than your standard issue Sentinel. But with discovering all this forces the X-Men to have to go tens of millions of miles into space and take out this station before it becomes operational and produces Nimrod this early, which is definitely a tall order. But the X-Men really don't have a choice but to attempt to stop this from happening, or at least prolong it for as long as possible. But that'll do it for this one, guys. In this video, I mainly wanted to talk about year 0 and year 10, and in the next one, we'll go deeper into year 100 and year 1000. Because man, there is so much to talk about. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below, assuming that your brain is not tied in a knot. But if it is, I totally understand. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.